Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to welcome you to the Ministry of Funds and Regional Policy, to the webinar that was organized by the National Contact Point, OECD National Contact Point. This is dedicated to the due diligence in the responsible networks, chains of deliveries. You can follow us on Facebook, on website, YouTube, and so on. And we've invited to our webinar international experts today. That's why this webinar will be translated into English. You can follow YouTube webinar in Polish and in English. When we were sending you the invitations to this webinar, we were sending you two links. But right now, if you entered this Polish channel on YouTube, you can just scroll down and you'll see a link to the English version. What's also important is that this webinar is being recorded, and you will find the recorded webinar under the same links that we were sending you with our invitation. As you can see on the screen, because we are in the Ministry of Funds and Regional Policy that is responsible for coordinating a big governmental program, Accessibility Plus, all our events are translated into sign language, and we have the sign language interpreter as well. And this is a pleasure for me right now to invite the Minister of Funds and Regional Policy, Minister Puda, to open our event officially. Over to you, Minister. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome everyone. Unfortunately, today we are still using the online formula, but I hope that soon we will be able to meet here in a bigger group in the room named after Madam Gęsicka. And I hope that the future meetings will not only be just online meetings, but first and foremost, live meetings. I would like to welcome representatives of business, of labor unions, of employers' unions, industry organizations, as well as the social organizations. And we have invited you to watch a webinar that was organized by Polish National Contact Point, OECD Contact Point. And during this webinar, we will be discussing the most important issues connected to due diligence in business conduct. We are meeting online, and as I've said, I really hope that the next meeting will be organized in our ministry, and it will be a live physical meeting. As you can imagine, today's webinar will be dedicated to a very important subject, and it is connected with the planned EU directive, connected with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. But the most important objective of the directive proposed by the European Commission is the strive to a situation in which the businesses in their conduct do not result in effects that would harm human rights and environment. That's why this due diligence obligations that will be introduced for specific groups of employers. It is also important to emphasize that there is a need to ensure an effective access to legal aid for those who have been affected by the negative results of the business conduct that affect human rights and environmental issues. We know that this directive that has been awaited for many circles, and when the European Commission published the draft at the end of February this year, well, a lot of emotions and expectations appeared, as well as questions. So the question, what will be this due diligence, which enterprises will be covered by this regulations, what will be the sanctions, what will be the penalties, what will be the benefits stemming from implementation of this directive. Well, I must say that we don't know the final answers to all questions, but the draft of this directive is still negotiated, and many things may change also because of the meetings that we are having right now. Well, I also have to remind everyone about other documents that will be complementary to all the obligations, such as guidelines for business and human rights, or guidelines for multinational enterprises. As you know, in October 2021, the Council of Ministers have approved the National Plan of Action for implementation of the guidelines for business and human rights for the years 2021-24. This is a strategic document of the Polish government in which we say that because of the planned legislative changes planned on the level of EU, well, the subjects will be also included in the teams that are responsible for the responsible conduct of business and so on, and social responsibility of the enterprises. Under the preparation for another directive, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that also covers the due diligence related issues. And that's why we invited experts, practitioners who are involved in those issues on everyday basis. They represent a wide array of stakeholders, public administration, representatives of business, civic society organizations, industry organizations, or university science circles. We would like to also invite a similar group of experts to cooperate with us in promoting the information and the progress in our works on the directive on the due diligence in sustainable development. But before it happens, please listen carefully to our webinar. During this webinar, we will tell you about the details about those concepts, the due diligence concept proposed in the guidelines for business and human rights, and the responsible business standards worked out by OECD. Today, we will also present you a Polish version of the document, OECD Guidelines for the due diligence in the responsible business conduct, and we believe that this may serve as a practical tool for enterprises in implementing procedures of due diligence. The Polish version of this document has been prepared by the OECD National Contact Point that is located in our ministry and is part of the network of contact point, which brings together around 50 countries in which we promote the standards of responsible business. Again, I would like to emphasize that the Ministry of Funds and Regional Policy is not only promoting this vision of the responsible business conduct, but is and wants to be an active partner for grassroots initiatives and projects. That's why I invite you to participate in today's webinar and the future webinars dedicated to responsible business conduct and to join our team for the sustainable development and social responsibility of the enterprises. And I believe that we will be able to learn from each other, and the exchange of information between us will affect in changes that may not be very famous, but will serve everyone. And in our opinion, your involvement and your strive to promote the responsible business conduct conduct is a very valuable support for us in our everyday work, and we really hope that we can continue this very good cooperation in promoting responsible business conduct in Poland. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good webinar.
Thank you very much, Minister. In the traditional circumstances, if we had audience, there would be an applause now, and thank yous to the Minister for his presentation and an encouragement to watching our webinar. I hope this will be really interesting. Now I will display a presentation. I hope we can do this, and I will say a couple of words how the agenda is structured. So the first speaker will be the expert of the Polish Human Rights and Business Institution, Beata Faracik, who for many years has been engaged in the activities connected with the respect for human rights in business. We also invited the Institute to cooperate at this webinar because this is a member organization of the institutional stakeholder OECD, that is OECD Watch. The next speaker will be Barbara Bijelic, expert for legal expert in the OECD Responsible Business Contact Center, who shall present the concept of due diligence regarding the multinational enterprises. Then we shall present the Polish version of OECD guidance, and then we will talk to the experts on whether due diligence can be a tool that helps the process of risk management in enterprises. For us, this is also a technological challenge of a kind, because this is the first time when we organize a webinar with experts located remotely. We also have the interpreters. I hope this will all work. And now over to Beata Faracik, who shall present the concept of due diligence, covered by the document also mentioned by Minister Puda, OECD guidance. Beata, over to you. I can see that we are already connected. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Good morning, Minister. Over to you. And we will be changing the slides from here, from the studio, but the floor is yours now. Thank you very much. And now, could you please start the presentation? It's a great pleasure to be able to take part in this webinar and to bring closer to you the OECD guidance pertaining to business and human rights, though adopted already in 2011 in Poland and more broadly in Central and Eastern Europe. They are relatively little known. Why should we become interested in this topic, which is already 11 years old, and why should we understand the concept of due diligence for human rights? Why is it so important for enterprises if they want to function efficiently on a market where the expectations regarding responsible production are higher and higher? This question will be answered. So, first of all, we need to remember that the existing for years, the minimum standard, this is just a minimum standard of procedure to which a range of other regulations refer, soft regulations and also legal regulations. In other words, this is a standard that affected a whole range of intergovernmental standards, initiated by, for instance, the business circles, the more progressive business circles. These are also initiatives and standards launched by investors and business leaders who understand that against all appearances, the costs of violations of human rights are high costs from the perspective of operations of enterprises. Of course, they want also to prevent human tragedies that can be caused by violations of human rights. The important thing, as has already been mentioned also by the Minister, the guidelines are a standard that is so established and so integrated by the far planning entities that it affected regulations not just at the regional level. An example is a range of regulations and directives at the EU level, but also regulations in various countries, both in EU member states and third countries like the United States, Australia, and Great Britain. We have already there is already a range of references to the guidance using the concepts that have been used in the guidance for the first time. Already there have been some rulings where courts consider the guidance and the minimum standards contained in them as the rules of social coexistence. An example can be the recent ruling of Dutch court, New Defense Against Shallow. So, Minister also mentioned that the reference to the guidance, again, a reference to a certain document that is already considered the obligatory standard, is also present in the taxonomy, which means that companies who are serious about their future development, companies that want to fit the green economy trend, those who want to get better co-financing and better credit conditions, need to take this into account. The taxonomy clearly mentions the OECD guidance for multinational companies as standards that companies just have to abide by in their everyday operations. So the most important thing is that the guidance and due diligence are implemented. They are so important because they make it possible to identify and prevent the risks generated by companies in their activities, both direct and those in the value chains. This is about particular people's human rights. In other words, the implementation of due diligence procedure makes it possible to prevent human harm before it happens, and along with good fiscal procedures that make it possible to capture irregularities as soon as they appear or even before, makes it possible for companies to obtain to benefit financially. From the perspective of a company, it is very important that violations of human rights simply generate very serious losses at their side. So it simply pays off. It pays off for entities and other organizations to adhere to human rights. And why the UN guidance is so respected. Over 6 years, when the works were underway, they involved all the stakeholders, both the businesses, the local communities that experienced human rights violations, and lawyers. Over 47 consultation meetings were organized on all the continents in 20 countries, involving lawyers who have experience in over 40 jurisdictions. So this is not an element written by 3 experts or 5 experts, but an element developed in a very long process and, importantly, tested in practice even before it was adopted by the UN Council. At that stage, the feasibility of due diligence regulations was tested under a pilot project by 10 big global organizations. So this is a document that is not an invention of academia, but it is based on a solid good background, and it also contributed from what the world of business brought.
And now we are moving into the understanding of what the OECD guidelines mean. Three pillars. First of all, three pillars that focus on two main actors. On the one hand, the states, the countries. So here we have the first set of guidelines, such as UN guidelines. This is the set that is directed at the states, that remind the states that they must ensure the protection of human rights through the legislative system by their own responsible management or, for instance, state-owned companies. They should create this kind of environment, the kind of incentives that opens the field for everyone. The other pillar is directed, addressed at the enterprises, and this is where we find regulations related to due diligence. And here, the guidelines say that the companies, that the business is obliged to ensure that the human rights are respected. They are responsible for that in their everyday operations. And then we also have guidelines about situations when the human harm is happening, when something went wrong. And in this part, the guidelines tell us what to do in order to mitigate or compensate the harm. What institutions should be ensured by the governments and by the enterprises. As we can notice here, Pillar 2 and 3 refers to the enterprises. Of course, we can see here state-owned companies that affect the enterprises, but from the perspective of employers, of the entrepreneurs. So we should focus on Pillar 2, because this is where we find information how to respect human rights. So the company should be aware of the obligations, of the responsibility, of the fact that the company is obliged to ensure human rights, that the human rights are respected. And this is, for instance, declaration on human rights or any other form. And this should be a declaration in which the company emphasizes that they strive to respect the human rights in their operations. The next step is the implementation of the due diligence procedure, and we will actually talk about it more. You will see that this is a certain cycle that refers to the self-accomplishment, self-perfecting cycle. So we try to find out how we affect the environment, the humans, and the next step would be to conclude and to ensure that the risks that were identified won't happen. And the next step is checking whether the procedures implemented are working, whether the trainings that were implemented are effective and efficient, whether the safety procedures are effective. And the next step is the periodical measure of indicators and checking out what can be done in the future periods. And this is connected with preparation of reports or integrated social reports or any other reports. But this is the stage of reporting, also financial reporting. The minister mentioned a directive that will regulate more strictly this area very soon. And when we actually look at the very guidelines, well, the first stage that I have mentioned, well, the responsibility of the business for respecting human rights is crucial. And as we mentioned, what is the main objective of the due diligence and the operations that should be implemented by the enterprises? This is all to ensure that we can prevent negative effect on human rights as well, and this is pillar 3. And wherever the violations has happened, we can ensure reparatory actions. Sometimes the enterprise can include several people and sometimes several thousand people, and sometimes those violations will happen. We are simply just humans. Sometimes this will be and in such a situation the enterprise will be responsible for repairing this situation, and wherever possible repair that will mean going back to the original situation. And sometimes the violation may affect in death or serious injury. In such case, we cannot bring people back to life, but the enterprise will be definitely responsible for the damages for ensuring the compensation. So the other area of human rights respect involves the enterprise's obligation to prevent this kind of risks in their chain of deliveries. So not just in their own operations, but also in the operations that are undertaken by their contractors, suppliers, and so on. Well, this will all depend on the size of the enterprise, on the clients. But for instance, if we are simply very small client for our supplier or contractor, well, we are still responsible for ensuring that this party knows that we only buy services, accept services and products that were produced, generated with the respect for human rights. So here we have a leverage that will be strongly tied to the size of the enterprise, linked to the sector, to the industry, and the number of producers and so on. Well, this will all be connected with the effect, with the impact of the enterprise. But it is also important to know that it is also important because of how often, whether this is the first business contact or we've been cooperating with a certain company for 10 years, for instance. So our business relationship will be important. So it is important not only when we think what is our impact on this business partner, but from the perspective of due diligence and evaluation of risk for respect for human rights. Well, the degree of relationship does not matter. We are still obliged to make sure that the human rights are respected. Well, we have also talked about it. So guideline 15. Here we can see that in order to comply with this obligation, well, we need to ensure a policy in our enterprise that will then translate into procedures, and then we need to implement due diligence process. We need to have procedures and operations that will also ensure the reparatory actions, mitigation, and so on, whenever violation happens. And then the next slide, because we are simply too far. Number 17. And now, what's important in guideline 17, which gives us details about due diligence and what is the purpose of due diligence? Well, we need to remember that the due diligence must cover a negative impact on the human rights that can be caused by the enterprise, or when this can be directly linked to the enterprise and the services and products. Well, this will differ in terms of complicity because of the actually the size and the context and the operation of the enterprise, because the very risk of forced labor will look differently in Poland, in Brazil, or in Bangladesh. Well, this will all differ depending depending on the geographical location, and the enterprise must also analyze this as well as the threats and risks in different geographical areas.
And importantly, often forgotten by enterprises, this should be continuous actions connected with detailed real dialogue with the stakeholders, with those around. And we have another slide. There is emphasis that due diligence, this is the continuous process of managing the risk generated by the company for people. Companies frequently see due diligence in human rights as a diagnosis in the company's risks. Of course, the risk for people translates to the risk for the company, but the main, the principal aspect here is that the diagnosis is to pertain to the risk, to the threat that the company constitutes to the people, not the other way around. And the goal is eliminating, reducing the risk of adverse impact. Next slide, and in the next slide, the traditional approach, there is often a misunderstanding because frequently the notion of CSR is mistaken for human rights in business. They are similar, they are close, but on the one hand, in the one we are talking about the avoiding the loss of trust, and in the other one with we are not talking about simply calculating the probability of the risk. It's about the reduction of violations of human rights. From this point of view, notions are key connected with how to identify the most important points from the area of human rights. In a moment, we shall also mention prioritization because, of course, every company has a limited funds, and the authors of the guidance also point to that. But when works are started at the creation of due diligence processes, it's necessary to identify the most important areas of human rights, the areas where the company generates the biggest, the most irreversible impact, and human rights at risk of the potential most serious adverse impact of the company's operation. Their implementation is most important. This is salient human rights issues, and we need to remember about the scale, about the scope, about remediability, and about the probability or likelihood that comprises business relation, operational context, and whether we have sufficient procedures, whether we've had them so far. It is not so that the companies did not have them. All the work and occupational procedures are part of the remedial actions. Next slide, please. Earlier it was said that companies are obliged to ensure the respect for human rights because violations in this respect must be avoided. Human rights are human rights. They are rights. So at the other side, there are obligations, and companies need to ensure that the rights are respected. But as Grzegorz mentioned, the bigger the risk for the people, the bigger the risk for the particular people, the bigger the risk for the business. This needs to be remembered, and this risk needs to be avoided. It also needs to remember that due diligence is there to prevent, first of all, prevent violations, and this is what is worth focusing on without forgetting that compensatory mechanisms have to be provided if violations happen. But with prioritization of actions, we first of all have to focus on the actions that will make it possible to avoid the most serious cases. Unless the company has a bigger budget, then more things can be implemented simultaneously. But prioritization is needed. It does not mean that we can forget the rights that are at smaller risk, but it's only logical that we should focus on the ones where the risk that the company is causing might be most irreversible. And the salience, the most salient matters are most important, more important than whether it seems to us that the liquidation of the risk is important for the company. The essence of due diligence in the scope of human rights is identifying and preventing human harm to people. Avoiding costs by the company is actually the last thing in the row, in the order that we should take into account. And next slide, please. Earlier we talked I mentioned that this is a cycle, that due diligence is a cycle from identification of the impact through the prevention processes, their implementation, tracking, checking whether the processes work, and continuation or implementation of more effective solutions. On the example of Poland, maybe this is the last slide now, we can see that there is a range of solutions and tools that are to support enterprises in the implementation of due diligence. On the example of publications prepared by the team who the Minister mentioned and the group operating under it for worker relations, a publication was developed how to avoid forced work, which includes a range of tools divided or maybe distributed around the cycle of due diligence. So there is a ready repertory, and the tools are available not just in PDF as publications. The particular tools are also available in a format that can be edited for you to download and use. This can be surveys, this can be contractual clauses that you can use in your practice. And now, can I have the last slide, please, where there is a reference to reporting, namely, very often companies have a problem at the stage of reporting. What should be reported as regards human rights? So what needs to be reported is what the company does to avoid human rights violations at the level of profit generation, and what the company does in terms of investment in social infrastructure or charity. Even though these are very important areas, this is not an element of human rights in business conduct. From the point of view of UN, whether the company donated money to certain organizations and how much, this doesn't matter, because this is the use of profit that was generated. And in the UN guidance and the OECD guidance are about what should be done to generate profit with zero violation of human rights or the smallest possible violation. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful continuation. Thank you very much, Beata Faracik, President of the Polish Institute of Human Rights and Business, member organization of OECD Watch. Beata will stay with us because we will be having a very brief discussion after the presentations. Do not worry about this bulk of information and materials. We are sending a signal to you that when thinking about the new EU regulation directive regarding the due diligence in enterprises, enterprises should be preparing for this regulation by studying various documents. The concept of due diligence, as you have heard, was initiated in the UN guidance in 2011, and back then another important standard of responsible business, that is OECD, guidance introduced the concept of due diligence. And to tell you how this looks, the concept of due diligence from the perspective of OECD, we invited an OECD expert, Barbara Bijelic, with who we'll be connecting. Ms. Bijelic is in Paris. Some of you may remember Madam Bijelic, who is a legal expert in the Center of Responsible Business of OECD. Barbara visited us in Warsaw before the pandemic in March, and she presented back then a document targeting the finance sector, namely a document targeting banks during a workshop for the finance sector that we organized in Warsaw. So this is not our first meeting. Welcome, good morning, and over to you.
So please present Polish public the OECD guidance for multinational enterprises and the approach of OECD to the due diligence.
Thank you, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to be here today. And indeed, sorry, I can hear the interpretation. I'm just going to lower my volume. Indeed, the last mission I took before the pandemic was to Warsaw, so fond memories of that. I have a presentation prepared to just give you an overview of sort of OECD instruments on due diligence and how these are being reflected in policy and market initiatives. I think the good news is, just off the bat, I can say that our recommendations under OECD instruments fully align with those of the UNGPs. So Ms. Faracik already did a lot of the hard work in outlining the key concepts and expectations. I'll try not to repeat, but just to add maybe a little more practical guidance and orientation. Great, thank you. So we could go to the next slide already. So as Jacqueline mentioned, I work within the Responsible Business Conduct Center of the OECD, where our primary mission is really promoting and implementing the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. It's an international instrument on responsible business conduct. It's been around since 1976, and it covers a wide range of issues. In 2011, it was updated to include an expectation of due diligence, which, as I mentioned, aligns exactly with what is recommended under the UNGPs. However, it's broader in that it goes beyond human rights impacts to look at all or most of the substantive obligations under the guidelines. So beyond human rights, it also covers employment and industrial relations, which are also often human rights issues, but also environmental impacts, which are becoming increasingly important in the context of due diligence policy. And for some companies will be the most significant and severe impacts that should be prioritized. I think climate here is a salient example, particularly in the context of the financial sector, which is the sector I focus on specifically. It's been viewed as the risk, that is the most grave, broad, and irremediable. So it'll be something that investors will want to prioritize. So the recommendations is the same, but the gamut of issues that we call on companies to look at under the guidelines is a bit broader than what's under the UNGPs, although there's a lot of relationships and interlinkages amongst these different risk areas and thematic issues and human rights, of course. Next slide, please. I think we can skip this one. It's really repeating what Ms. Faracik said. It's a process for business to identify impacts in their own operations, but also across their value chains and supply chains. So broadly, we have our foundational instrument, which is OECD guidelines. The language around due diligence in that instrument is pretty minimal. It's a couple of paragraphs in our general policies and in our human rights chapter. But we have been developing sort of technical and practical due diligence guidance to support those recommendations now since 2011. We have thematic sector guidance for the garment sector, financial sector, agricultural sector, and mineral sector. And those guidances really help to operationalize and provide more detail on what companies can actually do in practice to identify impacts, to use leverage to prevent and mitigate them, to integrate these expectations across their operations. Because due diligence processes will look pretty different depending on what sector you operate in, what kind of company you are. And I think Ms. Faracik mentioned that as well. However, in 2018, we did publish a general due diligence guidance, which draws together the foundational measures and actions we would expect for any sort of due diligence process. So it's meant to be cross sectoral. It could really be applied by any sector, and just outlines the really general and sort of essential expectations under the framework, but again, in a practical way. And it's really this general due diligence guidance that has now formed the basis of a lot of the legislation we're seeing discussed, and some of the also sustainability reporting expectations that are coming out, which I'll speak to in a little bit as well. Just to note, of course, we also develop these guidances with business, but also with UN human rights colleagues and the ILO. So they can help businesses operationalize expectations across the three leading instruments on due diligence. Next slide, please. So I think this was explained pretty well in terms of the key measures and practical actions that we would call for under a due diligence approach. Maybe I could just add a little more detail in terms of practically what does this look like. We mentioned the need to introduce policies and commitments at an enterprise level. In our specific due diligence guidance, we provide a little more meat on what that means, what you'd expect to see in such principles. That would be commitments to international standards, and it would be actually a description of what you're doing on due diligence, as well as expectations for your business relationships to make sure that there's alignment there. And it would also involve what we call functional alignment. So looking across your business and thinking about the different units that need to be involved in the due diligence process. This is often, of course, sustainability teams, more and more legal and compliance teams, but then also those dealing with supplier issues in business relationships, even in product design. So making sure that all those teams are working towards the same objectives, which is thinking about potential environmental, social, human rights risks associated with products and services, and then taking specific action to prevent and mitigate those. Maybe also just to note, identification, that, as I mentioned, practically will look different depending on what type of industry you're in. But broadly, it involves sort of general scoping to understand where the areas of risk are across your value chain and own operations. And then once you have sort of a landscape of that, zooming in using prioritization to do more in-depth assessments, which could be done through audits, which could be done through interviews with suppliers, which could be done through consulting third-party resources and market research providers to really understand at a business relationship level what is the risk profile and how can you best mitigate it. Maybe I'll move on because I think a lot of this was covered in the first presentation. So next slide, please. So how does this differ from traditional compliance approaches? I mean, a lot of businesses, of course, already tackle environmental, social issues, but they're often very much focused on their own activities and operations. And of course, this goes beyond that to think about business relationships, not just in terms of direct suppliers or customers, but across the entire value chain, which I know is quite, can be quite intimidating, especially for companies that have complex supply chains. But I think a very important characteristic that was already spoken about is that the process is meant to be risk-based. So companies are not meant to tackle and understand and address every single risk under the sun from day one. They can prioritize those that are most significant based on severity, scope, and irremediable character, and then move on over time as those are addressed. So that risk-based approach is really important to making sure that the process is manageable, but then also to making sure it's effective and really focuses on targeting the risks where there's the most potential for harm, instead of engaging with business relationships that are maybe most proximate to a company or where action might be easiest. Sorry, the slide is very small on my screen. So, oh yes, I think it was mentioned already, but of course, stakeholder engagement is also a key component of the process, and something, that companies in the extractive sector, for example, have been doing a long time, but we think is a really useful and valuable tool for all sorts of companies, both in understanding what their exposure to risk looks like, but also in prioritizing and coming up with effective measures to prevent and mitigate risks. So stakeholder engagement consulting with those impacted, but also with experts on the issue throughout the process is really a key part of it. And then, of course, ensuring that any actual impacts that a company is causing or contributing to are remediated is very important to making sure this is meaningful. And that was discussed in detail, so I won't repeat that. I think maybe just the other key point to note here, which isn't on the slide, is that it's also meant to be a process of continuous improvement. So as mentioned, under our standard, we don't have sort of technical benchmarks or criteria. We don't also expect, risk-free supply chains or zero risks. We understand that this is something that is evolving. We want companies to engage with business relationships rather than de-risk or disinvest as a first resort. So that means we expect a process of improvement over time rather than perfect conduct, which also makes the process more manageable. And then the second component of the risk-based approach is that you can also tailor your process according to your own operational realities and constraints. And I think this was also discussed in detail, so maybe we can go to the next slide. Ms. Faracik also discussed a lot the risk-based prioritization approach. I would add that our standard is aligned in the sense we also call on companies to prioritize the risks that are most significant in terms of scale, scope, and irremediable character. But we also recognize that even once you do that, you might be left, with a broad range of issues to tackle. And in that respect, your prioritization process might be informed by other things as well. That's things like legal obligations. So we know in some jurisdictions, enterprises are called on to conduct due diligence for forced labor, specifically in supply chains, or conflict minerals. That's government sending signals to business on what they think they should prioritize. They might also prioritize based on their most significant business relationships. So if you're a garment manufacturer, you might focus on, that's producing primarily cotton garments. You might prioritize engagement with cotton suppliers rather than those providing, embellishments on your clothing that might also be linked to impacts. And then crucially, it should be informed by stakeholders because this is not an exact science. It will be a judgment call by companies a lot of the time. It could change as context changes. So it's important to do that consultation to make sure decisions are credible. We think also, companies often react to these recommendations, again, feeling a little intimidated and feeling that they'll be expected to address every type of risk that they're exposed to across global value chains, and that's quite a hefty burden. The prioritization and risk-based approach is meant to mitigate that. But of course, companies can always be, again, criticized by specific interest groups that they're not tackling all issues. So we think, and we really recommend that companies communicate publicly their prioritization approach to make clear, what they're focusing in on and why maybe some things have not been prioritized, and also to demonstrate that they're improving over time and taking a dynamic approach to this. Next slide, please. Maybe since I think you received a lot of information already on the concepts and measures, I can just say a few words on what we're seeing in terms of policy developments on due diligence. And before I do that, I just want to note we actually have an e-learning academy online that's completely free. You just have to register and provides online training to business on the due diligence approach. So I can share a link to this community. It's all in English, unfortunately, but I think it's a great resource that you can sort of go at your own pace and even repeat modules if it's not clear, to really understand more clearly what the expectations are, as it's hard to absorb all this information in just a 1 hour time. But just to note, and then I think Minister Puda also alluded to this, we're seeing a huge amount of uptake of due diligence recommendations in law and policy, particularly in the past couple of years. Currently, about 75% of OECD countries have introduced or are considering introducing mandatory due diligence legislation, but it goes beyond that too. We're also seeing legislation being introduced in Central Africa and India. Thailand just committed to introduce mandatory due diligence. So this is very on trend, and we can expect it, I think, to continue for a couple of years. Broadly, we're seeing 3 different types of legal expectations that are all sort of linked to the due diligence obligation. One are policy expectations on conduct. So actually calling on companies to identify impacts, carry out due diligence according to a certain plan, and demonstrate that they're taking that action appropriately. The second is sustainability disclosures, and this is the CSRD has already been mentioned a few times. We're seeing sustainability law integrate expectations of due diligence reporting. So what that actually looks like and says is that companies need to be reporting on their policies and processes to integrate due diligence. They need to also identify their general areas of risk, as well as the specific areas of risk they've identified, and explain their prioritization approach. And then they need to communicate on what they're doing to actually address those impacts and to what extent they've been effective. So those sort of very clear reporting expectations on risk areas specific to a company are kind of new. They were integrated into the GRI Universal Reporting Standards last year, and we're seeing them also become a big component of the expectations under the revised CSRD. But just to note that due diligence reporting has been part of at least European non-financial reporting directive since 2014, albeit in less detail. And then the third type of expectation we're seeing are trade and customs rules, which often come in the form of trade bans. So basically, they prohibit the import of goods that might be linked to specific risk issues. Commonly, that's been forced labor or modern slavery. We have legislation like that in the United States. And currently, there's a lot of discussion about introducing trade bans for products made that contribute to deforestation. So that could be beef and other types of agricultural products, as well as, of course, lumber. And the EU is currently considering such a law. In that context, due diligence is a process by which companies can show that those products are actually not linked to those risks. So it's a mitigating factor rather than an expectation of conduct. Next slide, please. I wanted to just give you an overview of all the different type of legislation being discussed or that's already been introduced at the EU level, because of course this will impact Polish companies. So obviously there's the CSDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that's currently under discussion. There's been a huge amount of attention to that. That's something we can expect to be released next year. We've seen the Commission as well as the Parliament make really concerted efforts to try to align the expectation in that regulation to the OECD due diligence guidance. And actually that's made explicit in the law. So companies that are looking forward on how this might impact them can already consider implementing expectations around the due diligence approach, or looking at the e-learning academy to understand what this might mean for them. There's also, as I mentioned, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. But beyond that, there's also other legislation that's already on the books or soon to be on specific for specific industries or risk areas. And I think the financial sector is one very relevant one, as it's the most advanced. Next year, investors in Europe, asset managers, will have to start reporting on their due diligence processes and on the presence of what is known as principal adverse impacts in their portfolios. So the EU has actually outlined indicators associated with companies that investors will be called on to screen. And two of them link specifically to OECD instruments. They ask for screening on whether companies have management systems to comply with these instruments and whether they commit to them. The EU taxonomy regulation also makes reference to the OECD guidelines as a minimum safeguard standard. So for any activities that are to be classified as sustainable in sort of an environmental sense, they also have to be assessed to be not contributing to social harms. And what that means is actually still being worked out. The OECD participates in an expert group to help sort of define that. But increasingly, it's going in the direction of having companies demonstrate effective due diligence processes for these issues. And then, as mentioned, there's a few specific risk issues. The EU is discussing introducing a trade ban type of law for goods made using forced labor, where due diligence would be a mitigating process. As mentioned, there's already a law on mineral supply chains, which is extremely rooted in our work and guidance on responsible mineral supply chains. There's discussion ongoing on an EU Deforestation Act and also on a Digital Services Act. So really a lot to keep track of, and depending on what sector you're operating in, you know, a combination of these different laws might be relevant to you. But for all of them, our frameworks and recommendations really represent a fundamental part of the expectation, or at least a way of responding to it. Next slide, please. Just to note very briefly in terms of our work at the OECD, in addition to regulatory engagement, developing these sector-specific tools, we have some cross-cutting work. One is very focused on alignment assessments, so working with industry initiatives, but actually increasingly also in the context of policymaking to enhance alignment with our standards. This is to avoid a proliferation of non-aligned expectations for business or different types of initiatives, just to promote clarity in the market and streamlined approaches and efficiency, which can also save costs. We also have training programs. I already mentioned our e-learning academy several times, but we do more in-depth training programs for specific sectors on our sector tools. And increasingly, it's been now about 10 years that we've had our minerals guidance in the world, just over less than 5 for our general guidance, but we're already thinking about how can we actually measure the impact of these instruments? How can we also track uptake to be able to more empirically demonstrate the value add of implementing these and how they can be very useful in terms of risk mitigation, but also, as mentioned by the previous speaker, in also mitigating risk to business and enhancing reputational value. Next slide, please. Oh, that's the end of my presentation, but it looks like I'm right on time. So very happy to take any questions, and thanks again for having us here today.
Dziękujemy. Bardzo dziękujemy. Pani Barbara Bijelic, ekspertka OECD do spraw prawnych i należytej staranności. Jak Państwo widzą, jest bardzo dużo informacji, bardzo dużo się dzieje w obszarze odpowiedzialnego biznesu i w obszarze należytej staranności. Barbara, dziękujemy. Prosimy jeszcze, aby Pani została z nami przez chwilę przez całą prezentację, którą teraz ja będę prezentować.
I will have another presentation. I will present the information about OECD guidelines for due diligence in responsible business. This will be in Polish, and then we will come back to you and to Beata Faracik with our questions about due diligence. 2 words from me. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the OECD National Contact Point. As you remember, I hope, Poland is a member of OECD since 1996, and the Polish contact point was created in the Ministry of State Treasury, and then it was moved to Ministry of Economy, and for a moment it was part of the Polish Agency for Information and Investment, and since the 1st of June 2016 it has been in Ministry of Development. Now this is Ministry of Funds and Regional Development. All information has been provided online, and also in this leaflet in which we brought together all the information about the due diligence, about responsible business, and our national contact point. This website and this leaflet is both in Polish and in English. As Minister Puda has mentioned when he was opening our webinar, our national contact point for responsible business is part of the network of 50 contact points, hence our website in English, so that we can communicate with our colleagues from other countries, and they also run their own contact points. But ladies and gentlemen, what are we going to talk about today? will be very helpful to you. This is a very helpful tool, OECD guidance on the due diligence in responsible business conduct. The guidance is to complement all the issues, the whole idea of due diligence introduced by OECD, and in 2018 OECD published a document on due diligence exactly, and this year our ministry published Polish version, and I would like to present it very briefly, tell you about the Polish version. But I need to remind you that other documents, OECD documents, are also translated into Polish, and if we have representatives of finance today, you can actually read about the due diligence in the documents that are dedicated to this sector for institutional investors or guidance for the banking sector. But let's actually focus on the due diligence document. In English, it is 100 pages, but Polish version has 98 pages. That was a huge success because normally translation is longer than the original version, but we were actually able to fit into 98 pages. This document can be downloaded from our website. We know that sometimes it's hard to find the right link on the ministry's website. So first of all, we go to the ministry, we go to the top ministers, and then what do we do? Support for enterprises, social responsibility of the enterprises, CSR, national contact point, and then the guidance, and then you will actually see the document that can be downloaded. So the document comprises of several parts. So first, introductions, then we have two descriptive parts, chapters, and then we have appendices, so questions and answers, which is a great tool for the business, because among those questions you can find the questions that you may have yourself, and then you can find answer to those questions. Before we start discussing the details, please see a table about acronyms and abbreviations, because we decided to leave a generally known abbreviations in English. For instance, know your counterparty, know your client. This abbreviation is functioning on the market. RBC, which is the responsible business, that this actually translates, explains the approach of OECD. So this was left, but we've included SME abbreviation in Polish, because these are small and medium-sized enterprises. And now, what is the definition of due diligence? According to OECD, it means that the enterprises should have a positive impact on the economic, environmental, and social development. And as you can see the ESG letters that are very important, very popular in recent days. So this is economic, environmental, and social. So they should also avoid any negative effects that can be caused by their operation. They should prevent such a negative impact, and then make sure that those negative effects don't happen and mitigate them. So, again, the due diligence guidance, they don't cover all guidance for multinational enterprises. They do not refer to the issues connected with science, technology, competition, and taxes. But as you can see, they refer to all enterprises, multinational enterprises, so subsidiaries, So,
też do wszystkich jednostek zależnych, czyli wszystkie
so subsidiaries and the core enterprises. All multinational enterprises should strictly follow those proposals that are included in this document. So the first chapter discusses in detail what is the due diligence in business operation. That is a responsible operation. You will find the definition that says that due diligence should cover many processes and objectives, should match different circumstances in the enterprise. And so we have a title. So, for instance, due diligence has a preventive nature and what it involves.
In the first part, you will find two frames explaining the topic of risk, how risk is understood in responsible business conduct, and what is cooperation when implementing due diligence. The second part pertains to the entire due diligence process. It describes the particular steps, the 6 steps of the due diligence process. Interestingly, the steps are described in a way, well, take step 3, that is cease, prevent or mitigate. This is about adverse impacts, and there is a certain thesis what this is to be about. Specific practical actions are proposed, practical measures. This can be very helpful because you can reach for this and check if such practical measures can apply in your enterprise, or you can see what you can do to implement such practical measure. In the further part of the document, there are 2 parts. They are based on questions. It's questions and answer. The first part are questions about due diligence in general, and the second part, this is the implementation of the process of due diligence in the company. In the first part, we have 13 questions, and these questions like who are the stakeholders of the enterprise. You will find the answer explaining that the stakeholders can be all the interested entities that are outside and the enterprise and inside. You need to remember that the employees are also stakeholders. So this is how this is structured: question and answer. I'd like to show you the details of the second part, namely how the questions connected with the due diligence process look. Step 1, inclusion of the RBC principles. Step 2, step 3, up to step 6, and all steps descriptions. Well, we can ask a question: what elements can constitute responsible business conduct policies? What expert knowledge can be used for this? So which teams or operational units should be considered when developing and adjusting the enterprise's responsible business conduct policies? And this way we take you through the particular topics. In the second part is a very interesting scheme explaining what is adverse impact, what are the adverse effects. In the document, in descriptive language, we often say that an enterprise's negative impact, adverse impact, can be caused directly by the enterprise. This can be the impact to which the enterprise contributes, and this can be adverse impact that is directly connected with the company's operation, its products, services, or connected through business relations, the supply chain. That is step 3. Step 3 sees, prevent or mitigate adverse impacts. We have a dozen questions here, slightly fewer questions for step 4 and 5 and 6. Step 6 is about remedial actions or cooperation at remedial actions. There is a clear explanation what remedial measures can be undertaken in connection with due diligence, what remedial action means, and what is the meaning of cooperation with legal remedial mechanisms. This sounds a bit complicated, but this is a term that is used in the language of due diligence. We also want to show you that this document includes information on the national contact points of OECD for a responsible business, and we suggest, if you want to learn about the Polish OECD contact point, visit our website, but also on the 12th of May we organized an interesting webinar about the current trends of development of the standards of responsible business. A lot of information about OECD contact points can be found also there. To sum up, I want to leave you with a slide showing a map of all the standards of OECD. We have the big guidelines published in 1976, updated in 2011. The definition of due diligence was added. Then we have a range of documents addressed at the particular sectors: the extraction sector, the textile sector, the agricultural sector, the finance sector, and we also have the general guidelines for due diligence. As you can see in the slide, almost all of these elements are already available in Polish. Still one remains to be translated. Our apologies to the agricultural sector, and we promise that soon also the Polish version of this document will be available on the website. So we encourage you to use the resources that were discussed today. And now I'd like to get back to our experts and ask them our final question about due diligence, because it seems to us that you received a big dose of knowledge. But together, ladies, Ms. Faracik and Ms. Bijelic, let's try to answer the question whether due diligence can serve as a tool helping the process of risk management in enterprises. Beata Faracik, over to you. Yes, very much so. Thank you very much for this question. I believe that to a certain extent I tried to communicate this in my presentation, that actually, to a large extent, the process of due diligence consists in preventing risks. It's about preventing risks that are generated and affect people, the particular individuals, but this translates to the risk of the company. And from the perspective of risk identification, it's necessary to change the vector, to remember that now what we are looking at is whether the measures that we are implementing, the actions that we are taking, have a negative or positive impact on the surroundings, rather than think that what happens around us generates a risk for us. The two are connected, of course, but yes, this is a process of risk management, actually, and this very clearly was evident in our discussions when developing the tools for the prevention of forced work. So there were comments from companies managing risk, from persons managing risks in companies. We are talking about a very broad risk here. I believe that a big value of due diligence, of the process of diligence, is that we can identify, when trying to identify the risks for people, we also identify a range of the earlier unidentified risks for the enterprises as well. Very closely connected. This action will be very closely connected with the implementation of various other regulations.
So we are checking the due diligence in different sectors, industries, but we also mentioned the process in the chain of supplies. This will be connected, and because on the level of it was approved, it was passed on by the Council on Human Rights, the right to clean and sustainable environment. Well, we will see the references there. So protection of environment will be connected with the human rights. So we need to also focus on those areas that will have to be diagnosed by the companies, and the knowledge about the process of due diligence will help us to identify the risks in other areas, not just in human rights, but also in the area of environmental, for instance. Barbara, from the OECD perspective, all those tools prepared by OECD, do they help the enterprises? Do they support the enterprises in finding out, in explaining that due diligence helps to manage the process of risk?
Yes, and I can only agree with what was already said by the previous speaker. Of course, our tools are focused on sort of an inside-out perspective to risks. So we're talking about risks to people and the planet rather than risks to company itself. However, it's becoming increasingly clear that there is a lot of overlap and that a lot of these kind of impacts are actually financially material to a company. So there's a lot of studies out there, especially now with huge momentum and interest in ESG products and ESG investing, that show a direct correlation between businesses that have strong RBC performance and strong financial performance. There was a meta study by Deutsche Bank published about 4 years ago that kind of collected everything existing out there, showed over 90% of studies showed a positive correlation. About 8% showed a neutral correlation, and just 2% showed a negative correlation. So the vast majority of empirical analysis has shown that strong responsible business conduct, implementation of ESG risk management frameworks leads to better commercial performance as well. And we saw this really clearly actually during the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, we saw that companies that were already undertaking supply chain due diligence, already thinking about environmental and social issues across their supply chains, fared better. They were less hit by the severe downside risks that happened following the pandemic, because they had already a clear understanding of their supply chains and strong relationships with their suppliers and business relationships, so they could take swift action and think about how to mitigate the risks and issues. And I can only say that, of course, with the introduction of mandatory expectations on due diligence, of course, this will increase because there'll be legal compliance costs associated with not undertaking these processes. So it would be something companies really need to do well to avoid, legal costs, and that comes with also higher reputational costs. So really, it helps with risk management, but it helps also, of course, with financial performance. And maybe just one other thing to mention in that respect, beyond just sort of like the negative risk management and cost mitigation, of course, companies that demonstrate responsible business conduct and commitments to sustainability, human rights issues, do better also in attracting and retaining employees. So there are positive benefits as well above and beyond just the risk management.
Bardzo dziękujemy za to wyjaśnienie. Jak widzą
Państwo, as you can see, the due diligence should be seen from many different perspectives and on many different stages of your operation. You can come across implementation of due diligence and different tools and mechanisms that can be helpful in implementation of due diligence. We are coming to an end of our meeting, but I have one more question to our experts. Would you like to add anything to summarize, to wrap up our meeting today? Maybe there is an important message. I'm sure that Beata Faracik would like to add something. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that a very important aspect for me is the fact that the human rights violation issues can be a cost to the companies, but we are still humans and we wouldn't like to be harmed. So let's not harm other people through negligence or purposeful actions, premeditated actions. So let's not do those things to other people that we wouldn't like to be done to. And one more thing, my reference to what the other expert has said. Please remember that many tools have been initiated by the investors and by the insurance companies that understood that as long as the financial reports give the pictures of the past, how they were doing in the past, and maybe some prognosis forecast for the future, but a good identification of risks also in the area of human rights and environmental protection shows us where are the risks that can cause future costs or reputation risk or legal risk or a risk that is connected with payment of high damages because of the harms that will happen. Deepwater Horizon is a great example of how it is not worth to save money on safety measures and installations. So let's remember about this aspect. Well done. Due diligence will help us to avoid future risks and costs and human tragedy. Thank you very much. Yes, the last sentence was very important to us. Barbara, do you agree that a well-implemented due diligence will help us to avoid many losses and costs in many aspects, human, equipment, also financial?
Yes, I think I do. And I mean, my closing message would just be, just don't be scared. This is a doable process. A lot of companies already have processes in place that can be built on to integrate due diligence expectations. So it is something, that is implementable, that is meant to be scaled to your own operations and really help with risk management. There's a lot of resources out there for companies seeking to do this, including the new Polish guidance, but also including the Polish NCP. So a role of NCPs is to provide advice to companies to handle inquiries related to OECD standards. So I would say use your NCP. They have expertise on these issues. They can help you navigate these expectations and point you to the right resources. And I'll just end it on that. Thank you.
Świetnie, bardzo dziękujemy. Czyli proszę Państwa, prosimy podążać za radami ekspertek.
Follow the advice of our experts. Please use the materials, documents that were prepared by the UN and the OECD. That's all from us today. I hope that it was interesting, and as Minister Puda has said, we will continue those events. But now Dominik Szostak will tell us about future events. He represents the governmental unit for a legislation process. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all speakers today. This is a very special year for us, as the Minister has emphasized this, and our experts have stressed it today. We started working on the directive. In Brussels, we have a working group in which we have the representatives of the ministry. So not only OECD guidance, but also documents prepared by the European Commission, relating to the due diligence are becoming more frequent, and I believe that we will have more information about due diligence, and this will be the subject that will become essential this year and in the future. Now, technical issues. I would like to encourage you to check out our website. We have a tab on the directive, so Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and we will present basic information about the directive in Polish and English, as well as Polish government's position on this directive. And now, as regards our works in the coming months, in September we will have a meeting of the team for sustainable development and social responsibility of the business, and we will have the groups in that team, and one of the groups will be responsible in supporting the ministers in the works on this directive. I need to stress it because in the ministry's operation it is very important to include the stakeholders, and this is what we want to do by creating this kind of group. But that's not all. After summer holidays, we will appoint a counseling advisory team by the national contact point, and this team will also work on the due diligence issues as well.
I think that's the most important information that I wanted to share. I'd like to invite you to the conference on the 2nd of June on the social responsibility of universities, and I encourage you to visit our websites where we publish information on an ongoing basis about the events and what happens at the ministry. Thank you very much indeed.